Hi, Baden Hill hikers. Well, it's with a heavy heart that I make this segment because it has to do with something that has impacted my life. Most of the history that we've discussed was before my time. I can talk about it. There is sometimes an emotional feeling, but in reality, it's very distant. But the Vietnam War was a part of my life in a very small way. My mother's cousin was named Robert Anders, and he was an officer, and he went to Annapolis, and he was well educated and was destined for a great career. He was deployed in Vietnam, and he was murdered in Vietnam. That's all we know. It was mentioned in his obituary, his official record of his death, that he was killed in a vehicle accident, only there was no vehicle. There was no evidence that there had been a vehicle. And so it seemed like a way to explain something that was a mystery. And the bottom line is that all soldiers who die in war are murdered in a sense, at least if their deaths could have been avoided in some way. I experienced this as a young child when I was about 4 years old, because my family went to visit my great aunt, my mother's aunt, who had lost her son, and my great uncle as well. I should mention both of them. My great aunt survived my great uncle by quite a few years, so I always think of her by herself. But both of them were special to me, and my great aunt was my baptismal sponsor. And so as a result, I had a fairly close relationship with her growing up. She only had one child, her son, who was lost in Vietnam. And so when I went to visit her and them in Minnesota, I was just a child, but what they did is they gave me some of his personal effects. And I still have them to this day. So it's something that weighs heavily on me when I talk about the Vietnam War, why it happened, and in many ways, why it didn't have to happen. But then again, I know that there's a purpose for everything. So let's talk about how this all started. And this is a daunting task because I'm actually going to talk about two wars. I want to talk about the Korean War and then the Vietnam War. And they go together. A lot of people don't really think of how closely connected they are. In order to understand this, we have to know about the years 1949 and 1950 and the upheaval that was going on in the region of Korea and then later Vietnam. At the end of the war, there was this huge vacuum left behind by the retreating Japanese and also by the colonial powers that had been weakened and exhausted by war, and they either were ready to give up their colonies or they weren't able to hold on to them. And so the end of World War II created these vacuums. I want to talk about a conference that was held in the Crimean region, which is the Black Sea. And so it's a peninsula in the Black Sea. It has been a part of Ukraine. It was recently taken over by Russia in a power grab, a land grab, and it's still controversial to this day. But a conference was held at Yalta, and it was among the leaders of the Allied forces, including Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the main leaders of the Allied forces, except for Charles de Gaulle. Now, Charles de Gaulle was the leader, the general leader of France, and France had fallen to Nazi Germany, but then had been liberated again. Charles de Gaulle was someone who wanted to show that France was just as strong as the UK and the United States. And the relationship between Charles de Gaulle and Roosevelt was not very good. And there was a sense that de Gaulle was leaning towards socialism. And so Roosevelt didn't necessarily like the idea of the French having control in East Asia. Well, at the conference, there were agreements made between the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union. And these agreements had long-term, far-reaching consequences. Basically, Stalin wanted assurances. He wanted assurances that some of the territory that had been lost by the Soviet Union would be restored, that there would be some benefit for the Soviet Union to join in the war in the Pacific. So the agreements that they came up with were mainly that the Soviet Union would agree to join the war about 3 months after the fall of Germany in Europe. So when the war ended in Europe, 3 months later, the Soviet Union would join the war in Asia. And this actually was profoundly impactful, because what would happen is the United States would drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the Soviet Union had just entered the war. And so they barely had to fight at all. And yet they were still able to reap the massive benefits in East Asia. One of the things that the Soviet Union was concerned about was having a warm water port in Port Arthur. Now, they had control of Port Arthur. They had been renting it from the Chinese, but the Chinese had lost it to the Japanese. And so they wanted the lease on Port Arthur restored. And so that was a part of the agreement as well. And finally, the main thing was that the Korean Peninsula would be occupied by the Soviet Union from the north. The northern part of Korea would be controlled by the Soviet Union, and the southern part would be controlled by the United States until democratic elections could be held. That was the understanding. And unfortunately, those plans were fading into mist as soon as the war ended and the Soviet Union took over North Korea. It was very clear that they were going to establish a Stalinist government, a socialist, meaning communist government, which would be a dictatorship. So the Russians advanced into North Korea. The United States had control of South Korea, and the dividing line was basically the 38th parallel. Parallels are lines of latitude, and so the 38th parallel north, that was the line dividing the peninsula. So Korea was extremely important because of its strategic location and its many possibilities for warm water ports. Well, what happened was the North invaded the South. Okay, this happened in 1950. And as a result, the United States had to quickly send troops, deploy troops, and this is after World War II, when troops had just come home, and the United States was tired of war, but there was an understanding that the United States couldn't allow the Korean Peninsula to fall as China had fallen to the communists. And President Truman, with his Truman Doctrine, basically said, we are going to support anyone who is fighting against communism all over the world. And that meant Greece and Turkey, but it also meant South Korea. Now, you need to know that the Korean War was a United Nations war, and that's extremely important. It was the first time the United Nations had deployed troops to stop the North Korean / Soviet aggression. But what happened was, first, because the United States had not been ready for the North Korean invasion, the troops were pushed all the way down to a very small portion of the Korean Peninsula in the south called the Pusan Perimeter. And it looked dire. It looked like everything was game over. and the Korean Peninsula would be communist. But then there was a counteroffensive, a United Nations counteroffensive under the U.S., and it was the Battle of Incheon. It was an amphibious invasion, and it basically cut across the peninsula, cut off the North Korean troops. They were surrounded, and it was quite miraculous, really. And what ended up happening then is United Nations troops were able to push all the way to the Yalu River, which is the border between the Soviet Union and Korea. And so it looked like everything was going to be over in 1950. And then China entered the war. When China entered the war, it was very clear that this was going to be a long and very bloody conflict. And there was even a question at one point. General MacArthur was trying to lobby for the use of an atomic bomb on China, not only to end the Korean War, but to restore the nationalists in Taiwan that were waiting there, to restore them to China and take over the country. President Truman wasn't going to have that, and eventually Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur, was fired as general because he was defying Truman. So what ended up happening then is down from the Yalu River, the UN forces were pushed back to about the 38th parallel, and then it was more or less a stalemate. Eventually, there would be an armistice signed. Now, at the end of World War I, the armistice was basically the end of the war, but then there was a peace treaty signed at Versailles. Only in the Korean War, only the armistice happened. The peace treaty was never signed, and so technically today you have the North and South still in a state of war. Now, the town, the village, that was right in the zone of fighting was called Panmunjom. Panmunjom is that village, and it's the district that became the demilitarized zone, and so the village of Panmunjom is gone. But there is a house there that was preserved by North Korea as the peace house, the house where the armistice was signed. But the United States has a permanent garrison in South Korea and has hundreds of thousands of troops there because, I should say tens of thousands of troops, because of the constant threat that North Korea poses. So that was the Korean War. And again, we're talking about a divided land, and it's almost like deja vu as we move toward the next portion of our story. The Geneva Conference of 1954 is something we've already talked about. It was after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and that was the determining battle of the First Indochina War, and it ended French rule of French Indochina. And Vietnam should have been able to have its independence at that moment. The conference at Geneva in 1954 was designed to put to rest issues with Vietnam and also with Korea. They were parallel situations. You had two divided countries. You had two battles between communists in the north and Democrats in the south. At least that's how it should have been on paper. The United States was very aware that much had been lost, that China had been lost, that North Korea had been lost. And so there was this reference to, don't pull another Yalta. Don't sign away the lives of people and the land of freedom. Don't sign it away with a Yalta type agreement. And so after Truman came Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was determined to be strong. And he was actually ready to intervene in Dien Bien Phu to bomb the Viet Minh and keep France in control. So Eisenhower was ready to do that. But he resisted because the UK and other allies were not in support of this. And so the US basically stayed out. And remember, the US supported the Republic of China, which was retreated to Taiwan. And the US supported, a free part of Vietnam. They didn't want to give up Vietnam, and they supported the south of Korea. So there are all these situations that the United States is worried about. And basically at the Geneva conference, the United States said, we're not going to have any part of this, but they did attend, and basically they abstained, you could say. They didn't sign any agreements, but they agreed not to get involved. At one point, the negotiator from the United States refused to shake the hand of the Chinese negotiator, who was Zhou Enlai. Okay, Zhou Enlai, good old Zhou. We have heard his name many times. He has been a player from the very beginning of the Communist Party, all the way through as a part of the Nationalist Party, the left wing, and then being with Mao in the Communist Party. And eventually he would be the premier of China, the leader of China, more or less, under Mao and under Deng Xiaoping later. That conference was supposed to take care of all these problems, but it basically left everything hanging. It did determine that South Vietnam would be called the State of Vietnam, and the North Vietnam would be its own country as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, even though it was not really democracy, and neither was the South. The dictator in the South was an ally with the United States. He was anti-communist, he was anti-French, and he seemed like he would be, a good fit as the leader of the South. And supposedly he was going to give free elections, but he did not do that. His name was Prime Minister Diem, right? And so Diem refused to carry out those elections. And what happened then is an army was created, which was really a guerrilla army in South Vietnam. They were people who were sympathetic to the Viet Minh cause, the communist cause, but also the independence cause. And so that was called the National Liberation Front, and its nickname was the Viet Cong. And so the Viet Cong was an army in South Vietnam that was supported by the Viet Minh, which was the party of North Vietnam, and the Vietnam People's Army is the official name for the North Vietnamese Army. So the VPA and the NLF, you could say, are the VC. Okay, so VPA and VC. Those are the two communist armies, one from the north and one within the south. So you can see how difficult this situation is going to be with Diem as basically a corrupt leader that is getting money from the United States and oppressing his own people. Even though they're capitalist, he's still a dictator. So that's the situation in 1954, and it continues on through 1959. In 1959, things had gotten worse, and the United States sent about 30,000 military advisors. Well, basically these are soldiers, and it's because the United States doesn't want to declare war officially on North Vietnam. They simply want to have a presence there. That's a big presence. And so that leads us to the day everything went south, if you know my meaning, the day everything got worse. And that we call the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin is kind of central, and it is a place that the United States wanted to pay attention to, and it was spying the United States was spying on North Vietnam and the whole Vietnam situation, sailing, we say, in international waters. And the two ships that we need to pay attention to, the first ship is the USS Maddox, and then there was another ship called the Sea Turner Joy, which joined it later on. But the Gulf of Tonkin incident refers to what happened in August 1964. And right at the beginning of August 1964, so about 5 years after the advisors start going to Vietnam. And what happened was Vietnamese patrol boats fired on the USS Maddox. So there was an exchange, and this is very important because, you know, there was something that did happen. But the problem is that another incident happened just after that, and it was 2 nights later, and the same thing was perceived. There was radar that reported that ships were coming, and so the United States fired into the darkness and then reported to the White House and Congress saying that U.S. ships had been attacked twice. We now know that that second attack was a mirage. It didn't really happen. It was just a misinterpretation of the radar images. And so that second attack is what led Congress on August 7th, 1964, actually the Senate and the House of Representatives, both approved an escalation in Vietnam involvement. Basically, it gave President Johnson the ability to do what he saw fit to keep American troops and American interests safe. So it was up to President Johnson to do the right thing. And in his mind, the right thing was to immediately keep pressure on those who had attacked the United States. It seems like so many wars begin with a report of an attack on a ship, whether it's the USS Maine, and we know now that that was probably a fabricated incident where there was an explosion and it was blamed on the Spanish, and that was the Spanish-American War. Or maybe it's the Lusitania, World War I. That was a legitimate issue. But in this case, it's clear that the USS Maddox wasn't in danger, and that second attack never even happened. And that could have kept the Vietnam War from happening altogether. But Johnson, in his zeal, in his desire to defend the United States, began bombing the North Vietnamese mercilessly. It was called Operation Rolling Thunder, kind of a shock and awe mission where we wanted to bomb North Vietnam so that they would never consider attacking our ships again. And that continued from March in early 1965 all the way till 1968. By the end of 1965, there were almost 200,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. So not only had Operation Rolling Thunder kept going, but in July of that year, the first soldiers were sent. And that continued to escalate all the way to the end of the year in 1965 until there were 180,000 troops. And the peak of our troops in Vietnam was about 500,000. 500,000 troops in Vietnam. In fact, 543,000. I just saw the number. That's a huge amount of people. A huge number of young men who were drafted And remember that the system then was to choose soldiers within the U.S. randomly by lottery, but many people were able to escape that lottery draft, either because they had doctors who wrote notes for them, or because they were in school. Students were exempt, so if you were in school, you didn't have to go, or you had a high lottery number rather than a low number where it was easier to get picked. And so that was the situation, and the Vietnam War got worse and worse. What you should know is that in 1968, there was a massive turning point, and we will call it the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is what it was called, and it was a surprise attack. It happened during Asian Lunar New Year. We know probably about Chinese New Year, and you should know that Chinese New Year is celebrated in Japan and Vietnam and also in Korea, all over Asia. And so everyone was excited to be with their families, and many of the troops in South Vietnam were allowed to go on leave and be with their families for the Lunar New Year. And the Viet Cong, supported by the Viet Minh and the VPA from the north, launched a surprise attack in 100 cities. And it was a different kind of shock and awe. And because of this massive uprising in the South, suddenly everyone felt like the war had changed dramatically, even though some generals in the United States said, oh, this must be the end of the Viet Cong, and they're just desperate, and so they're just throwing everything at the troops and the government in the South. And they thought it was a huge expense of human life and also resources, and it just looked like maybe this was the end to them. But other people, especially those who were uncertain about the war, they saw this massive uprising, and they wondered if the United States was in an unwinnable war. And so this is January of 1968. And it wasn't only in the cities that there were uprisings and battles. It was also a case where the American embassy in Saigon was attacked, and the guards there were killed. So reminds me of another part of my own childhood, 1979, when terrorists took over the embassy in Iran and took hostages. So just know, when your embassy is under attack, it seems like the sky is falling and everything is going to go bad. So at the end of this, it actually wasn't a North Vietnam victory. The South Vietnam army was able to continue to hold on to the South and to restore order, but definitely there was a political victory, and the soldiers who had fought, especially the American soldiers who had fought in that Tet Offensive and who were in the middle of it, they resented what had happened. They probably were angry at the soldiers that were on leave with their families, and there were many who went AWOL. If you know what that means, absent without leave. They deserted the army and hid in the hills because, again, they thought that the end was coming. And so there was a lot of resentment and tension and conflict, and that would last, and it would basically lead to the next milestone of the Vietnam War. In March of 1968 came an event that Americans wouldn't know about for another year and a half. For another 18 months, Americans would not know that this massive, terrible scar had marked all of us for life. Even our children will be marked by this. It's called the My Lai Massacre. Again, describing it is painful to me because the My Lai Massacre was the killing of innocent women, children, and the elderly. by American soldiers. American soldiers had been frustrated. They thought that they were entering a village where the Viet Cong, remember the Viet Cong were rebels in South Vietnam. They thought that they were going into a village that was a headquarters for the Viet Cong soldiers. When they got into the village, they didn't find the Viet Cong soldiers, and probably in their frustration, they started killing anyone that moved. And they did it in such a way that showed they had no concern for human life, and that deep racism was a part of their background and was a part of their actions at that moment. We probably wouldn't know about this massacre except for a man named Ronald Ridenhour. Ronald Ridenhour was a soldier, and he kept hearing these stories about Pinkville. Pinkville. Well, pink had to do with someone who was leaning toward communism. Red, right? Not white, not red, but leaning toward red. And so Pinkville would have been a communist village. And it was clear that a massacre had taken place there. He heard the stories, and it burdened him so much after he left Vietnam that he had to write letters to congressmen reporting what he had learned from eyewitnesses. He got the ball rolling, but only 3 or 4 congressmen who received the letter out of dozens, only a handful of those congressmen actually paid attention to that letter and opened an investigation. And that got the ball rolling, and eventually members of the press heard something. They have their sources, and one of them was Seymour Hersh. And he heard about someone, a captain, who was being held in a military prison, and that captain was named, lieutenant. The lieutenant was named Lieutenant Calley. Lieutenant Calley. Lieutenant Calley was supposedly the man who gave the orders to massacre the people in the village. This is a case where we'll never really know what happened, but only Lieutenant Calley was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, but then, strangely, his sentence was shortened by President Nixon, and eventually he was released. Why? Was it because he was going to share other secrets? Hard to say. There are lots of conspiracy theorists, and I don't want to get too involved in that, but in a minute we'll talk about how difficult the year 1968 was and how many people really thought everything was coming apart at the seams. So, why did an atrocity like this happen? Why did the My Lai massacre happen in March of 1968? There was an investigation, and it was discovered that there were failures in leadership, discipline, morale, and now we have all kinds of movie footage, pictures that show the decay of the army that was supposed to be fighting against communism and protecting innocent people in South Vietnam. And basically the understanding was because new soldiers were coming in all the time, and as the numbers kept growing, new soldiers came in, officers were being rotated, and they weren't being trained properly. And so you'd have an officer like Lieutenant Calley who was in charge of a company, and his company was called Charlie Company, and would not know what to do, would panic under the great stress, and maybe some deep, dark problems would come out in the form of the fact that he and his men have guns and they can do whatever they want to do. This is not unique to Vietnam. We know that this has happened in every war, and this is just a case where maybe for the first time we had clear documentary evidence, and it's just an important thing for all of us to wake up to and pay attention to. Interestingly enough, the article about this massacre appeared on November 12th, 1969, which is the day after Veterans Day. It's the day after we have parades in the streets with soldiers. It was a day after everybody thought that, again, Americans could not do this kind of thing. But then the very next morning, people woke up to that news. (1968). There are a whole lot of people who wish that 1968 could just be erased from history. Maybe that's a great science fiction book waiting to be written, and you can write it. 1968 started with the Tet Offensive. In March was the My Lai Massacre, which we didn't know about for another 18 months. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. In addition, there were more and more protests by students. There was a student strike and all over the nation, and in New York alone, 200,000 students were out of class. Things were breaking down. In May, finally, perhaps seeing what was going on, peace talks were started in Vietnam between the North and the South. So it's an encouraging sign, but you need to know that President Johnson, after starting a run for re-election, he decided not to run for re-election. He announced it very dramatically just after Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, decided he was going to run against the sitting president. And that has a long history there. Well, it seemed like Robert Kennedy might be just what the country needed. He was talking about ending the war in Vietnam, helping people in poverty, changing things in the United States so we didn't have these deep-seated issues of racism that spread when our people went overseas. In June, as he was basically celebrating the victory in the California primary to become the nominee for the Democratic Party, as he was speaking to the crowd in the hotel, he was shot. He was assassinated. So not only was John F. Kennedy assassinated in Dallas in 1963, his brother was assassinated in Los Angeles in 1968. The Kennedy family, a family filled with so many tragedies, but a lot of it comes because they have given their lives to public service and they've put themselves in harm's way as soldiers, but also as politicians. In November, Richard Nixon was elected. We know what happened there. He talked about ending the war in Vietnam, but he also pursued some of the same policies that had created problems around the world. And we'll hear more about him. Finally, by December, the troop levels had reached 500,000. 500,000 troops in Vietnam and 30,000 dead. So that's 1968, a recap of one of the most terrible years that we can imagine in U.S. history for sure, but also in world history. And at the same time, you should remember that this was not the first war, and that the wars of the 20th century claimed tens of millions of people. So let's keep it all in perspective. Let's remember that wars do happen because of sinful human nature, because of greed and jealousy. There are wars between countries and there are wars within a country. And so these civil wars that we've been discussing, it should make us look at ourselves, and we should ask ourselves, what do we want and how do we plan to help our country grow together? Thanks for watching.